Hello, this is John Kraz again, and thank you for joining me for part 7, the glassing of the surfboard. The first step before glassing is cleaning the deck with a lint roller there to get all the dust off, fine dust. It's a sticky roller. And then I use a denatured alcohol just to wipe the whole board down and get all that dust out. The next step is I'm going to take some tape right on the middle of the side. I'm going to put a little tape skirt that allows the epoxy to drip off and not go underneath the board. Here I'm just going to cut it and size it up and make sure it sticks really well. And then right after that, I'm going to make little balls of tape and put them underneath the skirt that I just created to take the tape away from the edge and allow the epoxy to drip off onto the floor. On the fiberglass and cut it to size. Just lay it down and get a good cut. Smooth it all out and then cut close just at the tape line where the tape falls and trim it all the way around. Then after that I'm going to make it sure that it's nice and smooth for the epoxy. Here I go, I'm smoothing it out now. The next step, I'm placing my logo that I printed on rice paper from an inkjet printer. You put the epoxy on there and the paper disappears and all you'll see is the logo. In the background you see that I'm weighing out all my epoxy, my part A and my part B. I'm using an Entropy Resin. It's a bio-based epoxy that's made from sapwood, really good stuff. Highly recommend it. You have to nicely mix it for 2 minutes and make sure you don't introduce any air into it before you start using it. Here I'm putting down the logo, just making sure it's smooth, and then I'm going to lay down my first bit of epoxy right down the middle of the board, and then I'm going to work the epoxy front to back, and then from there I'm going to go on the from the middle to the edge of the board, just to get it nice and smooth and make sure I get all that material. No bubbles are in there, and I soak up all of the material with the epoxy. I'm going to leave down in the link below the link for the epoxy, so if you want to go and take a look at the sustainability of the epoxy and what they have to offer. This is my first time actually putting down fiberglass epoxy like this. I've never done it before, so I was kind of trying to go as fast as I could. I didn't know how much pot life I had. So the pot life is how long the epoxy lasts before it dries. Trying to also maximize how much epoxy I'm using so I don't waste any. It's very expensive. Here I'm making sure that I get the epoxy all the way around the edge and onto the tape, and make sure it's sticking nice to the board and it's not lifting up. Here comes Derek to check out my work. I let the epoxy dry overnight, and now I'm going to take a razor blade and go along the taped edge and get all that excess material off and the tape off the board. After I'm done getting the tape off, I'm going to take my sanding block and I'm going to sand the edges where the material, the fiberglass, meets the board, the edge of the board. Here I'm just checking the board, how the glass came to the edge of the board, making sure it's all nice and smooth. Just doing a little touch-up work, and then I'm going to dust off the board again. And then I'm going to prepare for the glassing of the bottom of the board. Here again, I'm putting my little tape skirt around again. And I'm going to have the little balls of rolled up tape underneath there, just so that the skirt doesn't go under the board. Make sure the epoxy drips off the tape. You can see that it's going underneath there, and the little balls of tape will bring it back out. So now the board is ready to put the bottom fiberglass on. Right now I'm just making sure any excess dust, any little material that gets on the board, I'm taking that all off with the lint roller again. Here I lay out the fiberglass again, and I'm going to trim it to the width of the length of the tape around the board. Down my epoxy again, right down the middle of the board, starting down from front to back, and then out to the sides, just smoothing everything out, and then I'm going to come back and go from the middle to the edge of the board. See me wearing a mask, but the smell of the resin, the epoxy, wasn't too bad. You really didn't need to wear a mask, but I just had one on just for precaution. Once I'm done here, I'm going to let it dry another 24 hours, then come back and cut off the tape, the excess tape and the excess fiberglass. Next here, I'm measuring out for the leash slash vent plug. I made in my drill bit, I have a stop there so to make sure I don't drill through the board. I was a little paranoid about that. Depth of the actual hole, make sure after I'm done drilling that the plug will fit in correctly. The next step is to put a little putty around the plug so no epoxy falls into the hole underneath. There's two holes in there, one for the vent and one to make sure that the leash plug fits in correctly. You do not want epoxy to go in underneath the vent plug and then block the vent. So you put that putty in and you just stick it in there and push it in. And then after that, I'm going to mix some epoxy up. This time I'm going to dye it black and then pour it around the actual leash plug, making sure that I do not get any in the top by taping off the leash plug and make sure it's covered completely. The leash plug I got from Greenlight Surf Supply. I'll have the link in the description below. They have a vent and a leash connector all in one. The actual plug is waterproof to 25 feet underneath water. Hopefully the surfboard will never go deeper than 25 feet. I don't think it will ever see that, and that's why it works. If you don't vent the board when you bring it out from the cold ocean and put it onto a warm beach, the air tries to escape from it. You could actually delam the board or have the board break away from the frame. So you have to make sure it's vented correctly. Here I'm mixing up the epoxy. In the epoxy, I also put in a little stuff to make it thicker. It's a thickening agent, so it doesn't go all over the board when you pour it in. I let that dry for 24 hours, and then I'm going to take my little Rotex sander here, put it on the aggressive mode, and sand it flush to the deck. The next step I do is the hot coat, but before I do that, I have to sand the whole board and make sure it's smooth. I use about 220 sandpaper here and sand the edges, make sure there's no clumps of epoxy anywhere. You want to make sure that you are wearing a mask with this and you cover up some of your clothing. The dust that gets in the air is very fine, and it's the epoxy dust. It could be hazardous. I also have on my sander a vacuum connection to vacuum as much of the dust so it doesn't get in the air. Once I'm done with the sanding process, I'm going to vacuum off the board again, get all that dust off of there, and make sure it's ready for the hot coat. After the vacuuming is done, I'm going to wipe down the whole board again with denatured alcohol and make sure all that epoxy dust is off the board. I'm going to have to tape up the leash plug again to make sure that there is no epoxy getting there. I'm also putting a skirt around so that none of the hot coat goes up and underneath the board and leaves drips, because they'll be hard to get off later on. Here again is I'm mixing up the epoxy. I'm getting ready to get the hot coat on. So the hot coat is essentially just putting another layer of epoxy on. They call it the hot coat is because the epoxy actually does get hot when you have the two parts mixed, A and B, and it starts to do a reaction and it heats up. So it's really hot in the hand. So that's why they call it the hot coat. At least that's what I found on the internet for the history of the hot coat. Here I'm taping off the plug, making sure that no epoxy gets in there. Same procedure, you start in the middle and then front to back, and then after you get all the way to the edges, you go down from the center of the board to the edge of the board. Once you spread all the epoxy out with the spreader, you take a 2-inch chip brush and then you go up and down the whole board and make sure it's nice and smooth and even. Here again, starting from front to back, from the center, and then once you do that, you go down from center to the sides. There we go. Once I'm done, I look for some bubbles in the epoxy. If I see any bubbles, I'm going to take a hair dryer on a low heat and just swirl it around where the air bubbles are. That it makes the air pop, and it releases the air from the actual epoxy. You don't want any air bubbles in this step. Once that's done, you let it dry for 24 hours and then come back and do the same thing on the bottom of the board this time. Here I prepped the tape and now I'm just mixing up my epoxy, always by weight, like I said before. And then you have to always make sure you mix the actual epoxy for 2 solid minutes. So I always set my timer and then I stir in a nice pattern, and not too fast, to introduce air into the epoxy. Here comes Derek again to inspect my work to make sure I'm doing it right. Here I'm just finishing up again with a chip brush. Make sure everything is nice and smooth. If I see any more air bubbles, I'm going to grab the hair dryer and with low heat again, take those air bubbles out. I really enjoyed this process. It was a lot of fun to do. I can't wait to do the next board. And I hope you tune in for the next time. I'm going to be installing the fin box with a router ring into the back or the bottom of the surfboard. And then I'm going to polish the surfboard. So please tune in again, and thanks for watching.